If we don't stop this now, Dry Creek will become our grave. Those were the words of Ethan McClane as he stood between two armed ranching dynasties, guns aimed, hatred boiling over. This is not just another Western. It's the true story of how two powerful ranching families dragged an entire town into a whirlwind of violence and revenge. Who will rise? Who will fall? And what lesson will survive? True Wild West Stories invites you to find out. The wind that rolled across Dry Creek that summer carried more dust than scent, and more warnings than words. Folks here used to joke that grass was worth more than gold, but by the time the sun rose over the low hills that morning, even the weeds had curled into brittle fists. Dust clung to boots, to fences, to the creases in faces that had seen too many seasons, and the air itself felt tight, like a rope pulled too far. Ethan McClane led his small herd back from the edge of the creek bed, his hat tipped low against the glare. He was 26, but his back already bent a little from work and worry. Each step of the cattle kicked up a red-brown cloud that hung in the air long after they passed, the way grudges hung in Dry Creek. Jonas, his father, waited by the gate, arms crossed over a sun-bleached shirt, eyes like chipped flint. "You see it yet?" Jonas asked without looking up. "See what?" Ethan untied the latch and swung the gate wide. "That Carter boy watering his stock from our side of the creek." Jonas spat into the dirt. "They're choking the vein and smiling while they do it." Ethan didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that Jonas's anger didn't need oxygen. It burned just fine on its own. He guided the cattle into the pen, gave a soft whistle, and closed the gate. Across the valley, on the Carter ranch, Abigail Carter moved through the kitchen, her apron dotted with flour, her dark hair tied back loosely. She wasn't supposed to notice the McClanes, not really. But she had seen Ethan once at the church picnic 2 springs ago. His quiet steadiness, the way he stood apart from the crowd, and the image had stuck like a burr. That morning she paused at the window while stirring a pot of beans, her eyes catching a flicker of movement at the far fence. Even through the shimmer of heat, she recognized the tall frame and steady gait. For a heartbeat, their gazes met across the distance, hers curious, his wary, before he turned away. By midday, the town's single street was alive with muttered talk. Men leaned on the posts outside the diner, hats tilted back, boots dusty from miles of fence line riding. Women carried baskets of dry goods but slowed their steps to catch each new rumor. The creek was running low, someone said. Carter hands had moved the fence again. McClane bulls had strayed too close to Carter pasture. Nobody said war, but everyone thought it. Inside Meyer's feed store, Ethan kept his head down while picking up salt blocks. 2 old ranchers were arguing near the counter. "They'll bleed us all dry," one grumbled. "Been brewing since last winter," the other muttered. "Jonas won't let it go." Ethan caught snippets, his own family's name, the Carters, and words like water rights and fence line, but he kept moving. The last thing he wanted was to be pulled into their bitterness. That evening, back at the McClane ranch, the kitchen smelled of beef stew simmering slow and cornbread fresh from the oven. Jonas sat at the head of the table, his big hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. Ethan took his seat opposite, while a hired hand set down a basket of rolls. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Steam rose from the bowls. The only sounds were the ticking of the old wall clock and the creak of chairs. Jonas broke the silence first. "You see Abigail Carter today?" he asked, voice low. Ethan glanced up. She was at their place, same as always. Jonas's jaw tightened. "Tell her father this. If they cut our water again, blood will run before the creek does." The words hung over the table, heavier than the smell of stew. Ethan felt them settle on his shoulders like a saddle he didn't ask for. He wanted to argue, to say not everything was Carter's fault, but the look in Jonas's eyes stopped him. There was no room for doubt in that stare. After supper, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The sky was a pale wash of stars, and somewhere a coyote yipped, lonely and thin. He leaned against the post, watching the dark silhouette of the hills. Beyond them lay the Carter Ranch, and somewhere in that darkness Abigail might be looking out too, wondering how long their families could keep pulling the rope without it snapping. He turned back inside, the smell of cornbread still warm in the air, and tried to push away the thought of fences and creeks and grudges. But even as he drifted to sleep, the dust of Dry Creek clung to him, carrying whispers of something coming. At first light the next morning, a sound cut through the quiet, a low, frantic bellow rising from the pasture, rolling across the valley like a warning bell. It was the kind of sound that made men drop what they were holding, the kind that told you something had gone wrong before you could see it. Ethan sat up in bed, heart already pounding, as the echoes of the cattle's cries filled Dry Creek. The sun had barely lifted over the low ridges when Ethan rode out to the east pasture, the horse's hooves thudding softly on the hard ground. What should have been a quiet morning smelled wrong, like rust and rot baked into the soil. He'd felt the unease even before he saw the first body, one of their steers, lying in the brittle grass, eyes glassy, legs twitching once before going still. By the time he reached the middle of the field, he counted 6 more, all of them down, all of them crippled. The cuts along their legs were too clean, straight as knife work, gleaming wet in the new light. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots crunching on dry stems, and knelt beside the nearest animal. The wound wasn't a coyote's ragged tear or a wolf's desperate bite. This was deliberate, cold, and practiced. He heard hoofbeats behind him before he heard his father's voice. God Almighty! Jonas swung down from his horse and stared at the carnage. His hands curled into fists. Those Carter bastards. Ethan kept his eyes on the wound, touching the edge of the cut with his glove. It's not Stockman's work, he murmured. Too neat. Jonas's head snapped toward him. Who else would do it? You think cows just cut themselves? He spit into the dirt, the saliva dark with anger. First they choke our water, now this. A few ranch hands rode up, faces pale under their hats. One of them muttered a prayer. Another cursed softly. Jonas straightened to his full height, his shadow stretching long across the bodies. I'm done waiting. They want to fight? They'll get one. Ethan stood slowly, dust clinging to his knees. We don't know it was them. Don't be a fool, Jonas barked. You think Carter's hands don't know where to cut? They've been watching our herd for weeks, but Ethan wasn't looking at the cattle anymore. His eyes had caught something else, prints in the dirt near the far fence line. He walked over, squatting low. The impressions were deep and oddly spaced, as if the rider had shifted his weight differently. The horseshoes were notched in a pattern Ethan didn't recognize, a custom job, not the standard iron most local ranches used. He glanced back at his father. This track isn't Carter's stock. Jonas's mouth thinned to a hard line. Don't you start defending them. He turned to the men. Ride back and spread the word. Tell everyone at the house to get their rifles. Tonight we meet at the barn and plan. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded. One rode off at a gallop. Another crossed himself before following. Ethan rose, brushing his palms on his jeans. He looked once more at the mutilated animals, at the red slick seeping into the thirsty soil. The smell was heavy, metallic, clinging to the back of his throat. The field, usually filled with the low hum of grazing, was silent except for the soft buzz of flies. He mounted his horse, but before turning back, he rode a slow circle around the edge of the pasture. Something about the scene nagged at him. He found a section of trampled grass near the fence where the prints overlapped in confusion, as if someone had dismounted in a hurry. There, caught on a splinter of weathered wood, was a scrap of dark cloth. It was stiff with drying blood and frayed at the edge like it had been ripped from a saddle or a rider's coat. Ethan tugged it free, turning it over in his hand. The material wasn't anything his family used. Too fine for a work shirt, too heavy for a bandana. He folded it and slid it into his vest pocket, his jaw tightening. From somewhere beyond the hills, a harmonica floated faintly through the air, a thin, wandering tune that didn't belong to any of his men. It drifted across the pasture like a ghost, rising and falling on the dry wind. Ethan looked toward the sound, but saw only heat shimmer and a distant buzzard wheeling low. Behind him, Jonas was already shouting orders, gathering men, and rage like kindling for a fire. Ethan lingered a moment longer, feeling the scrap of cloth press against his chest. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger and crueler than the old feud between two families. He turned his horse toward home, the harmonica's tune fading into silence as the first flies began to settle on the wounds in the grass. The church bell rang out over Dry Creek, slicing the quiet morning like a warning shot.
Colts gathered slowly along the dusty road leading to St. Luke's, Sunday clothes clinging limp in the heat, faces drawn tight with worry. Nobody walked with ease that morning. The bell should have signaled peace, but instead it dragged along 1,000 whispers. Inside the chapel, wooden pews groaned under the weight of worn bodies and heavier thoughts. Father O'Connor, his collar stiff despite the sweat on his neck, moved toward the pulpit with deliberate steps. He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. Rows of familiar faces sat stiffly. Ranchers, shopkeepers, widows, hands with sun-scarred skin. They sat together, but you could feel the split. The air between McClane men and Carter kin was thick and brittle. Ethan slid into the back row, his hat in his hands. Abigail was 3 pews ahead, her dark braid tied with a red ribbon that stood out like blood against her pale dress. She didn't turn, but he knew she felt him there. Word had traveled faster than horses. The Carters' feed barn had burned in the night. No one claimed to know how. No one said who. But in a town like Dry Creek, silence was its own kind of confession. Father O'Connor cleared his throat. "We gather today not just in worship," he began, voice steady, "but in need. Our church fund is gone. Stolen or spent, we don't yet know. And the fire last night? God knows that fire." A murmur rippled across the chapel. Ethan saw Old Lady Rankin lean close to whisper into her husband's ear. 2 pews ahead, Briggs shifted in his seat. Briggs had a politician's smile and a cattle thief's eyes. He stood now, not waiting for the father to finish. "If I may, Father?" O'Connor hesitated, then stepped aside. Briggs faced the congregation, with hands spread, like he was offering bread instead of bullshit. "I know tensions are high, but if we keep tearing at each other, we'll have nothing left but ash and old fences." His tone was smooth, rehearsed. "I propose a town meeting. No fists, no guns, just men talking like men." Someone clapped. A few nodded, but Ethan stared hard at Briggs's face, at the way his smile never reached his eyes. They were pale and flat, like the belly of a dead fish. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing grit across the wooden steps. And then, like a ghost thrown from nowhere, a folded sheet of paper hit the chapel door with a soft slap. A boy ran to grab it.
His small hands shook as he brought it to Father O'Connor, who unfolded it, read, and paled. Ethan stood, heart thudding as the priest read aloud. The Carter family took the water. The fire was justice. Next time it'll be their blood. Gasps. Someone sobbed. Jonas McClane didn't gasp. He rose slowly from the third pew, reached inside his coat and pulled out a revolver. He didn't raise it, just held it, as if reminding everyone that words had weight, but bullets didn't miss. Ethan stepped forward, voice low. Dad. Jonas's grip didn't loosen.
Let 'em talk peace all they want. But that letter speaks the only truth left in this town.
Behind them, the door to the chapel creaked in the wind. The bell above swung again, but this time no one looked up. As people shuffled out, hushed and shaken, Ethan saw Miss Ella locking the door of her general store across the street. She caught his eye, keys trembling in her fingers. "I'm closing early," she said, "till things calm down, if they ever do." And, with that, Dry Creek lost more than just its feed barn or its church funds. It lost the thin thread that held Sunday mornings together. Somewhere deep in the church, the letter lay crumpled on the floor. Jonas still held the gun. And outside, the air smelled faintly, not of incense or cattle, but of smoke. The air inside Sam's was thick with the scent of old pine smoke, stale beer, and the faint twang of a country tune winding its way out of the dusty jukebox in the corner.
Light bulbs flickered like dying fireflies above the warped bar, casting soft golden halos on scuffed tables and tired boots. The regulars were there, ranch hands nursing whiskeys, gamblers waiting for a late game, and Sam himself, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen too many years. Ethan sat alone at the end of the bar, a half-finished shot of bourbon glowing amber under the low lights. His shoulders were tense, jaw set like stone. The events of the past few days were stacking up inside him, hot and slow, like coals left too long in the pit. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble, in Dry Creek, had a way of walking up and pulling up a chair. "McClane?" came a voice, sharp as broken glass. Ethan turned. A pair of Carter boys stood nearby, broad-shouldered and red-faced with drink. One of them, Tucker if he remembered right, stepped forward with a sneer curling his lip. "Funny seeing you here. Thought your kind were busy plotting fires." Ethan didn't blink. "I drink where I want." "Maybe drink with your own," Tucker spat, knocking his boot heel against the floor. "Or maybe you're too busy sniffing around Carter skirts now." The air went still. Sam looked up from behind the bar, one hand slipping subtly below the counter. Nobody moved. Ethan stood, slow and steady. He took a step forward, close enough that Tucker could see the calm behind his eyes and the threat beneath it. "Say her name again," Ethan said, voice low. But before fists could fly, a hand reached between them, soft and firm. "Enough." Abigail. Her dress was the color of smoke, her eyes darker still. She stepped between them, gaze flicking from Ethan to Tucker like she was choosing which fire to put out first. "Tucker, go home. You're drunk and boring." He hesitated, pride flaring, but when Abigail turned her full stare on him, he mumbled something and backed off, dragging his friend with him. The bar breathed again. Without another word, Abigail grabbed Ethan's wrist and led him out the back door into the narrow alley behind Sam's. The night was cooler there, moonlight catching on puddles left from the old water troughs. Horses snorted in their ties nearby. "You shouldn't have come tonight," she said, releasing him.
It's not safe anymore. He looked at her, really looked. There was something fierce in her, the same fire that had sparked between them in that chapel. It scared him more than the threats, more than the blood. "I don't run," Ethan said. "I know," she replied, softer now. "That's what worries me." They stood in silence, shadows brushing against them. She crossed her arms, trying to hold back the weight of everything unspoken. "They're saying more fires might come, that someone's stirring things up." "Briggs," Ethan muttered. "He talks like a preacher but moves like a wolf." "I don't trust him either," she hesitated. But folks listened to him. Their eyes met, and in that still moment, something passed between them, uncertain, fragile, and dangerous. A connection neither could name, but both understood. Their families had sown hate deep into the soil, but in this quiet, the seeds of something else took root. Back inside, the jukebox warbled another lonely tune. Sam appeared at the doorway, his silhouette hulking in the light. "You two might want to hear this," he said. Group of strangers rolled in, rented rooms up at Miss Addie's place. "Don't talk much. Don't look like ranch hands either." Ethan frowned. "Briggs?" "Don't know, but they're watching. That's enough." Before Ethan could respond, the door creaked open behind them. All three turned as a tall rider stepped into the bar, long coat dusty from the trail, hat pulled low, shadow swallowing half his face. His boots were worn, but his belt was polished. A revolver sat heavy at his hip. Sam exhaled sharply. "That's no drifter. That one's with Briggs." The rider didn't look their way. He simply crossed the bar, sat at the far end, and ordered a drink without lifting his head. Ethan felt Abigail step closer, her arm brushing his. "You feel it too?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yeah, something's coming." And as the night deepened, the whiskey in his glass shimmered under the light, its ripples mirroring the storm no one could yet name, but everyone feared. The livestock market in Dry Creek was always noisy, voices hollering prices, cattle bellowing, boots stomping through muck. But that day, the chaos didn't come from animals or barter. It came from the unmistakable crack of a gunshot cutting through the morning air like a whip. Ethan had felt something off before it even began. He'd been watching the square from beside the old feed silo, squinting against the sun. The Carter wagons had pulled in early, lined with armed riders too jumpy for a cattle sale. The McClane men weren't far behind, their faces taut with suspicion. Ethan spotted Abigail near a stall, selling molasses candy, her eyes darting across the crowd, jaw tight, tension coiled like a snake in the dust. Jonas McClane stood near the auction pen, flanked by Silas and 2 other ranch hands. On the opposite side, Amos Carter was yelling about fair grazing rights, spit flying as his voice rose above the din. Ethan tried to move closer, to place himself between the heat, but by then the shouting had already turned sharp. "You think you can torch a man's barn and walk free?" Amos roared. Jonas didn't flinch. "We're not the ones hiding behind lies." The air hung still for a breath, and then, crack! A shot rang out. People screamed, horses reared, barrels overturned. A chicken exploded into flight from a nearby coop, flapping madly above the panic. Ethan ducked instinctively, pulling a child to the ground beside him. Another shot, then another. Somewhere, a woman sobbed. The crowd scattered like corn in the wind. Near the meat stall, Silas clutched his arm, blood already darkening the sleeve. A Carter boy, young, maybe 17, lay face down in the dirt, his rifle just out of reach. Someone was wailing his name. Jonas barked orders, pushing people back, scanning for more shooters. But Ethan's eyes caught something strange. A figure in a long coat disappearing behind the saloon. The glint of metal just visible beneath the hem. Not a Carter, not a McClane. Someone else. Ethan ran toward the alley, heart hammering in his ears. The figure was gone, but near the crates behind the butcher's stall he saw it. A spent shell casing, gleaming like gold in the sun. He crouched and picked it up, turning it between his fingers. Not standard issue. Custom engraving on the rim. Military grade, maybe even black market. No rancher in Dry Creek carried anything like this. Behind him the sounds of the market grew faint. The panicked voices, the weeping, the shouted accusations between families. The smell of manure, sweat, and blood clung to everything like a second skin. Abigail found him moments later, breathless. "Ethan, are you hurt?" He shook his head, still staring at the casing. "Not me." She looked down at his hand. "That's not one of ours." "No," he said slowly, "and it's not one of theirs either." They stood in silence, the world around them spinning out of control. Somewhere in the distance the sheriff's bell rang, a useless clang over the rising tide. Ethan pocketed the casing and turned toward the gathering crowd. "It's starting," he murmured, "and someone wants us to think it's just the McClanes and Carters." But he wasn't sure anymore who was really pulling the trigger. The Carter ranch that night was unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a man feel like he's being watched. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. Wind whispered through the fence posts and rattled the loose tin on the barn roof. The moon hung low and wide above the plains, casting long silver shadows that stretched like claws across the dirt yard. Ethan rode up slow, his horse's hooves muffled by dry earth. Abigail stood on the porch, arms folded tight against her chest, eyes darker than the night. She didn't smile when she saw him, just gave a small nod, like she'd been waiting and wished she hadn't. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice a breath above the wind. Ethan dismounted and tied the reins to the rail. "You said we needed to talk." She looked away, toward the dark line of trees along the property's edge. That was before the market, before blood hit the ground. He stepped up onto the porch. All the more reason now. Inside, the house was dim and cold, the fire long gone from the hearth. The walls carried the scent of cedar and something older, smoke maybe, or fear that had sunk into the wood over generations. They sat in the kitchen, Abigail keeping one lamp turned low between them. "I asked Silas to keep watch out back," she said. "He won't interrupt." Ethan nodded, though he noticed the way her hands trembled when she poured the coffee. He didn't touch his cup. "I need to tell you something," she said. "It's about the fire at the Carter barn, and the one before that." He waited. "Years ago, before you came back to Dry Creek, there was another fire. Same signs, same quiet before the storm. And back then, everyone blamed your family too." Ethan stiffened. "Wasn't us." "I know that now." She looked at him finally. "But back then, it tore this town apart for a full winter. We lost a dozen head of cattle and 2 barns. A McClane hand got stabbed in the middle of town. No one was ever caught, and everyone just let it go." "You think it's the same person?" Ethan asked, voice low. "I think someone wants to keep this feud alive. Someone not wearing either name." Outside, a board creaked. Both turned toward the window.
"Just the wind," Abigail whispered, but her hand moved to the chain around her neck. She pulled it out, a small silver cross worn smooth over time. Her fingers clutched it tight, knuckles pale. "I've been dreaming," she said softly. "Same dream every night this week. Smoke rising over the ridge, wolves at the fence, a man with no face." "Abigail," Ethan started, unsure what to say. "I know it sounds crazy," she cut in, eyes wet. "But something's wrong. Something old, maybe even cursed." The silence between them stretched, thick with unease and memory. Then a sound, faint but clear. The rhythmic clop of hooves, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, moving to the door. He opened it fast, stepping out into the porch light, hand hovering near his revolver. But there was nothing. Only the wind through the dry grass and the rustle of leaves in the dark. Behind him, Abigail stood in the doorway, cross still clenched in her hand. "They're watching," she whispered. "Whoever it is, they want us afraid." Ethan looked into the dark horizon, then back at her. "Then we stop giving them what they want." From the barn's shadow, unseen by either of them, Silas watched, face unreadable, eyes narrowed. Ethan lay flat against the brittle grass, chest barely rising as he watched the distant silhouette of a rider slip between the sycamore trees. The wind tugged gently at the dry weeds, whispering like a voice trying to warn him off. But he didn't move. Not yet. The rider wasn't alone. 3 others emerged from the shadows, all cloaked in dusters, their horses padded to muffle hoofbeats. They weren't local ranchers, no branding on the saddles, no familiar posture of men who worked the land. These were mercenaries, men who didn't belong here. The group paused near the dry creek bed, nothing but cracked earth and bone-white rocks now, but once it had flowed all summer. One of the men pulled a small bundle from his saddlebag, something wrapped in dark cloth. Another dismounted and planted a wooden stake into the dirt, hammering it twice before tying the bundle atop it. Ethan adjusted his position, crawling forward an inch at a time until the stake came into view. A McClane flag, red and black, slightly faded, but unmistakable. They were framing his family. His pulse quickened. He reached instinctively for his revolver, but stopped short. This wasn't a fight he could win head-on. Not tonight. One of the men chuckled, a dry, low laugh that triggered something in Ethan's memory. He'd heard it before. Not around a campfire, not in a saloon. At the church, Briggs, the bastard had played the peacemaker with the townsfolk, hands clasped, voice full of scripture. But here, in the dark, he was behind the curtain. Ethan couldn't see Briggs's face, but he didn't need to. The voice was enough. From their saddlebags, the men pulled out a few small charges. Gunpowder, wrapped tight in canvas. They lit them and threw them toward a cluster of dried bushes and an empty hay cart set near the Carter side of the land. Boom! The explosion wasn't loud, but it was enough. A fire burst up, lighting the false flag in dramatic silhouette. A frame job. The McClane colors waving behind smoke and flame. From behind a nearby boulder, Ethan gritted his teeth. It was a dirty play, but a clever one. By dawn, half the town would have heard that the McClanes attacked again. The men mounted up and turned their horses. One of them fumbled something from his coat, a scroll of paper tucked into his inside pocket. As he swung up, it slipped free and fluttered to the ground.
They didn't notice. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness, hooves lost in the rustle of wind and ash. Ethan stayed down another minute, just to be sure. Then, slowly, he crept forward. His boots crunched softly over the burnt grass. He crouched beside the embers and retrieved the fallen scroll. A map. He unrolled it under the moonlight. Faded ink traced the Carter property lines. But that wasn't what caught his attention. In the margin, red markings snaked along an underground stream bed. The path twisted beyond known boundaries, toward a symbol marked RES, Reserve, with coordinates beside it. A water source, hidden, maybe even an untapped spring. Ethan swallowed hard. They weren't just trying to start a war. They were trying to take everything. Behind him, the wind howled through the dry creek, skimming across the empty bed like a whisper of what once was. The moonlight gleamed off the shallow pools that remained, like silver eyes watching from the earth. The drought had made men desperate, but some, like Briggs, weren't just desperate. They were patient, and they were ruthless. Ethan folded the map, tucking it deep into his shirt, and mounted his horse. There would be no sleep tonight. Dry Creek simmered under a punishing late-afternoon sun, the kind that made dust rise in lazy spirals and tempers boil beneath the surface. The main street, once humming with daily chores and idle chatter, now stood eerily quiet. Doors were shut, windows latched. Signs flipped to closed long before sundown. Even the saloon, usually stubborn against tension, had its curtains drawn. Ethan stood on the edge of the boardwalk outside the general store, hat tilted low, eyes scanning both ends of the street. He'd seen this before. Not in this town, but in others. The calm before something ugly. The kind of stillness that made dogs whimper and old men clean their guns. At the far end of the street, Briggs leaned against the church steps, clean coat, calm hands, eyes that saw everything. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But Ethan saw it. A flicker of a smirk, quick as a knife flash. Briggs was enjoying this. Inside the store, Abigail stood beside Silas, arms crossed. "We can't keep pretending it'll pass," she whispered. "Jonas is moving men into the canyon. He's not bluffing." Silas exhaled through his nose, heavy and tired. "Neither are we." Ethan entered, the bell above the door jangling like it had forgotten how to be cheerful. "They're gathering behind the ranch," he said flatly. "Shotguns, rifles. They've got a plan." Silas didn't flinch. "So do we." "Damn it, that's not what I came to hear," Ethan snapped. "You're both feeding the same fire." Abigail stepped forward, voice lower now. "There's still time. Maybe we talk to Jonas." "Already tried," Ethan muttered, jaw tight. "Wouldn't listen." Eyes full of ghosts and grudges. "He thinks this town's still running on the same hate it bled 20 years ago." Outside, hooves thundered down the road. Jonas McClane dismounted with 5 men behind him, dust trailing like smoke. He stormed into the town square, hands clenched, shouting names. "Silas Carter, you got 1 day left to own up. After that, we settle this like men." Briggs stepped down from the steps, all grace and calm. "Brothers," he said loudly, arms wide, "surely we can find a peaceful path. Isn't that what God asks of us?" His words were honey, his smile poison. Ethan turned to him. "You're the one pouring oil on this, aren't you?" Briggs didn't answer, just gave a slow, pitiful shake of his head, as if he were above it all. By evening, the town held a potluck supper in the churchyard. It was meant to calm nerves, a gesture of unity. but the food sat mostly untouched. Cornbread crumbled in nervous hands. Pies were sliced but barely eaten. Nobody laughed. Children stayed close to their mothers. Men spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the edge of town where lanterns flickered at both ranches. At one table, Ethan leaned in close to Jonas. "Don't do this," he said. "You'll burn down more than a barn. You'll burn the future." Jonas didn't look at him. His eyes stared out past the horizon, where the Carter ranch sat quiet in the distance. "When the moon's full," he said, voice like gravel, "we ride." Ethan stood frozen. Jonas turned slowly, fixing him with a look that had no room for mercy. "We ride, and we end it." The moon hung low and swollen over Dry Creek, casting a cold silver glow that made every shadow look sharper, every shape more dangerous. The Carter ranch lay under that moonlight like a slumbering beast, fences lined up like ribs, corrals silent, barns dark but tense, as if holding their breath. Abigail stood near the porch steps, a rosary gripped tight in her trembling hands. The silver cross glinted faintly as she mouthed words she hadn't prayed in years. Behind her, the screen door creaked softly as Ethan stepped out, rifle slung low, eyes scanning the far tree line. "You feel it too," she whispered without turning. Ethan nodded slowly. "It's in the air." Like dry kindling waiting for a spark, down the hill the McClane riders were forming up in the moonlight. Jonas at the front, face grim, rifle across his saddle. 20 men behind him, some older, some barely grown, all with dust on their boots and fire in their veins. On the other side, the Carter men were no less ready. Silas stood near the barn, barking orders low and sharp. "No one fires first. Let them make the first mistake." Abigail moved quickly to her father's side, grabbing his arm. "Don't do this, please. There's still time." Silas looked at her, something soft flickering in his eyes, but only for a moment. "There's no turning back, Abby. They're here." From behind a ridge, Ethan spotted something odd, a flicker of movement, separate from the McClane line. A rider in a long, dark coat, sitting just off the main path. Watching, waiting. Briggs. He wasn't part of either side, but he was there, calm as a man at a card table. And he wasn't alone. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Beside Briggs was a second rider, tall, unfamiliar, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A scoped rifle rested across the saddle horn. Ethan felt the chill crawl down his spine. Suddenly a shot rang out. Nobody could say who fired first, but within seconds the pasture erupted. Gunfire cracked like dry branches, horses screamed, flames burst from the hay barn, orange tongues licking the night sky. Men shouted, bullets zipped through the air. Ethan ducked low behind a trough, eyes scanning for the sniper. He could see Briggs now, raising one hand, the motion smooth, deliberate. And then the stranger lifted the rifle. A shot whistled past Ethan's ear, embedding in the post behind him. Chaos surged as the cattle, spooked by gunfire and firelight, burst through the fences. Hooves pounded the earth, smashing rails, scattering men from both sides. A few fell beneath the stampede. Others fired wildly, trying to regain control. Abigail screamed from the porch, clutching the cross to her chest. Jonas rode through the smoke like a man possessed, shouting orders no one could hear. Silas tried to rally his men, but the flames had turned the night into a battlefield, and above it all Briggs sat perfectly still, his smile hidden in shadow. Ethan rose from cover, eyes locked on the sniper. The map in his mind beginning to shift. This wasn't a family feud anymore. It was something bigger, and it had just begun. Smoke clawed at Ethan's eyes as he stumbled through the burning yard of the Carter ranch.
The heat was so fierce it seemed to strip the air from his lungs.
But what burned worse than the fire was the realization settling into his gut. He was standing inside a play scripted by someone else. All around him, shadows flickered in the blaze. McClane men and Carter men were firing blind, not even sure at whom. Horses screamed, the barn crackled like dry bones snapping. Through the haze, Ethan spotted Abigail, crouched near the pump house, shielding her face from flying embers. He darted across the yard, ducking past a splintered beam that fell with a hiss. "Abigail!" he shouted. She turned just as a stray bullet tore into the wall above her. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind an overturned trough. "You have to get out," she coughed. "It's not safe." "It's not a fight. It's a setup," he rasped. "Stay low." He peered through the gap between boards. Across the yard, beyond the chaos, he saw Briggs, calm, untouched by soot, perched on his horse at the edge of the flames, one hand on the reins, the other gesturing like a conductor. And Ethan saw them, men in Carter dusters but with no Carter faces, loading rifles and aiming deliberately at McClane riders. Their boots were polished, their grips professional, hired guns, not ranch hands. Briggs's gesture changed, a quick flick of the wrist. The impostors shifted position and opened fire. McClane men yelled in pain, convinced Carter hands had shot them. Someone returned fire, and the circle tightened. Ethan's stomach turned. This was the proof he'd been chasing. Briggs wasn't mediating. He was directing the slaughter. A shadow loomed behind him. Before he could turn, a blow slammed into his ribs. He rolled, dragging Abigail down with him as a stranger swung again. One of Briggs's riders, coat singed at the hem. Ethan came up swinging. The two collided in the dirt, fists and elbows grappling between shards of burning fence. The rider drew a knife, slashing wildly. Ethan caught his wrist, but the blade nicked his forearm, hot blood spilling down to his palm. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him into the ashes. They rolled toward the edge of the burning pump house. Sparks bit into their clothes. Somewhere behind them, the water pipes burst with a hiss. The pump was on fire, water gushing out in a useless arc and then sputtering to steam. The town's lifeline was dying with the ranch. The rider snarled, shoving Ethan back, knife still in hand. Ethan slammed his forearm down across the man's throat, forcing the blade away. They grappled again, boots scraping on scorched earth. Abigail tried to reach them, coughing from the smoke. "Ethan!" "Stay back!" he barked. He headbutted the rider, stunning him long enough to wrench the knife free and fling it aside. But before Ethan could rise, another figure struck from behind, a hard crack across his skull, like a hammer on an anvil. Stars burst behind his eyes. His knees buckled. He felt himself dragged backward, the smell of ash and iron thick in his nose. Abigail's scream cut through the roar of fire, but his vision was already tunneling. He glimpsed Briggs one last time through the haze, that cold half-smile, glinting like steel. Then the ground came up and swallowed him. Darkness and ash closed over his face, and the world narrowed to the sound of flames devouring the pump, and the faint taste of blood in his mouth. and then nothing. Ethan awoke with a mouthful of dust and a throat so dry it felt carved from sandstone. His wrists burned from the bite of rough hemp rope, and the dull ache behind his eyes pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Somewhere above him, an old tin roof creaked under the wind, and light leaked in through cracks in the weathered walls of the abandoned storage shed. He tried to move, but the ropes held fast, looped tight behind his back, ankles bound as well. His boots were gone, so was his rifle. The air stank of mildew and old grease, and somewhere, rats scurried in the shadows. From the far corner of the shed came a voice, low, smug, southern drawl sharpened by cruelty. "Well, look who finally decided to join the land of the living." Ethan twisted his neck toward the voice. A tall, wiry man stepped into view, face pockmarked and eyes like cold nails. Wade Haskins. He was one of Briggs' oldest dogs, a man whispered about in 3 counties, known for doing dirty work cleanly. "You're not gonna talk your way out of this, McClane," Wade said, crouching. "Hell, you barely talked your way into it." Ethan kept silent. His tongue was sandpaper, but his eyes burned with defiance. Wade grinned, pulling out a canteen and tipping it just close enough for Ethan to smell the water before he yanked it back. "Nah, not yet. First, we chat." He circled Ethan like a coyote studying a wounded deer. "Briggs don't like mess," Wade muttered. "You poking your nose into things. That's a mess. Trying to play hero between 2 families who already hate each other? That's suicide." Outside, boot steps crunched on gravel. Then the door opened. Briggs crisp as ever, not a speck of ash on his coat. He stepped inside like he owned the dust, the building, the air. "Leave us, Wade," he said quietly. Wade hesitated, then nodded and stepped out. Briggs looked down at Ethan like a man surveying a ledger. "I warned you, Ethan. I told you some feuds are profitable, but you wanted to fix things." Ethan spat, barely missing Briggs's boot. "You're not fixing anything. You're poisoning it." Briggs's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm upgrading it." He paced slowly. "You ever been to Santa Fe? To Phoenix? You see what money does to dust? Turns it to gold. Resorts, golf courses, spas. All they need is water." He stopped and leaned down. "And I'm buying it. Every stream, every pump, every underground line under Dry Creek. Cotter land, McClane land. Soon it's mine." "You lit the fire," Ethan croaked. Briggs stood, shrugging. "Fires clear the brush. Make way for something better." He turned to leave. "You'll die in this shed, Ethan. But don't worry. I'll send someone to drag your body out before the buzzards find it." The door slammed. Ethan let his head fall back. Pain rippled through his ribs. But his right boot, the one they'd left on, still held a secret. A small, sharp knife tucked deep under the inner sole. He twisted bit by bit until he could reach it. The rope frayed slowly, every saw of the blade a bolt of agony. His wrists bled, but the rope gave way. With a grunt, Ethan freed his hands, then sawed through the cords at his ankles. He staggered to his feet, barely steady, and shoved the door open just enough to slip into the night. The shed had been built near the old Dry Creek bed, now a gash in the land filled with cracked clay and forgotten bones. He stumbled toward it, knees buckling. Behind him, a voice called out, a shout. He didn't look back. He reached the edge of the creek, heart hammering. Then a shot cracked behind him, and fire lanced through his side. He tumbled, rolling down the embankment. His body hit the dry stream bed hard, dust exploding around him. Blood spilled from his ribs, soaking into the pale dirt. Above, The moon was no longer silver. It was red, and somewhere in the distance, over the whistle of the wind through rotten planks, Briggs was laughing. The sky was bleeding. As the first light crept over the rim of the desert hills, it didn't come in golden rays or soft blues. It was red, raw and smeared like a wound across the horizon. The kind of red that made you think the land itself was aching. Ethan lay at the edge of the dry creek bed, half conscious, half dead. Dust caked the blood on his side, the wound clotting poorly. Flies buzzed nearby, and vultures circled far above, like they already knew how this would end. But he wasn't alone. Abigail had found him just before the sky began to burn. Her hands shook as she dragged his half-limp body up toward the rocks near a shallow cave mouth, a place kids once used to sneak off and tell ghost stories. Now, it was sanctuary. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long, warm shadows on the cave walls. Around it sat 5 others, townsfolk who'd chosen neither Carter nor McClane, folks who'd had enough of the feud. Farmers, a blacksmith, a widow with calloused hands. They brewed coffee in a soot-black kettle and passed around cornmeal cakes wrapped in old cloth. No one spoke much. The silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent, as if every soul in that place knew how close they were to watching their town die. Ethan stirred, groaning as he sat up. His chest screamed. But he was alive. "Coffee?" one of the farmers offered, voice dry as the hills. Ethan nodded weakly. The bitterness on his tongue grounded him more than any medicine. "You should be dead," Abigail said softly, crouching beside him. "When I found you, I thought you were." He met her eyes. "Still might be, but not before I do what has to be done." She placed a hand on his. "They'll listen. Maybe not all, but some. You're not the only one who's tired of watching this town tear itself apart." Outside, the morning light spilled in through the cave entrance like a silent trumpet. A few townsfolk stood to stretch, murmuring quiet prayers around the fire. One man drew a small wooden cross in the dirt. Another whispered over it, something about mercy, something about truth. Ethan listened, letting it sink in. He pulled himself to his feet, using the wall for balance. Every muscle protested, but he stood. "We don't have much time," a woman said. "Word is Jonas has rallied every man he's got. He's heading toward the Carter place. Says he won't stop this time." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked at the ragged group in the cave, people with blistered hands, sun-cracked skin, hearts worn by drought and loss. "Then we can't wait either," he said. He limped to the cave mouth, staring out across the dust-blown hills toward the heart of Dry Creek. The wind stirred the brush. The red sky still hung above, like a warning written in flame. "If we let them fight again," he said quietly, "this town won't survive it. Not the land, not the people. It'll all turn to ash." He turned to face them, his voice growing stronger. "But if we stand between them, if we show them there's still a town worth saving, they might stop." A long pause. Then a quiet voice said, "We'll follow you, McClane." Ethan nodded once, then turned back toward the horizon. Behind him, the fire popped. In front of him, Dry Creek waited, angry, fractured, and on the brink. And Ethan? He was done waiting. The chapel was colder than the night outside. Candles guttered along the narrow walls, their flames bending with each draft through the cracked, stained glass. Dust floated in thin ribbons of light. The air smelled of smoke and wax and something older, sin that had been kept too long. Father O'Connor stood in the doorway of the small prayer room, clutching a scorched Bible to his chest. His hands trembled, knuckles white against the charred leather. He looked smaller than Ethan remembered, his black coat frayed, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. "You came," Ethan said quietly. His own voice echoed off the stone like it didn't belong there. "I had to." O'Connor's voice was a rasp. "You're running out of time. We all are." He shut the door behind him and crossed to the kneeling bench, sitting down heavily. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and the muted crackle of the candles. "I should have spoken sooner," the priest whispered, "but he made sure I couldn't." "Briggs," Ethan said. O'Connor nodded. "You came to me years ago, promised money for the church, new roof, new pews, food for the poor. All I had to do was sign a few papers, witness a few transfers." He swallowed hard. "I told myself it was just business, that the town would benefit. But it wasn't. It was a noose." He reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His fingers shook as he handed it to Ethan. "Contracts. Deeds, state permits for water rights and drilling, all under shell companies, but all his. He doesn't want your family's land. He wants what's under it. He's been setting this up for years." Ethan unfolded the papers, the legal seals glinting dull red in the candlelight. His stomach turned as he read the signatures, the coordinates, the clauses for exclusive rights. Proof. Real proof. "You're giving me this now?" Ethan asked. "I'm done being his coward," O'Connor said, voice breaking. "You can still stop him, but you have to live long enough to show these." Ethan closed the packet and stuffed it into his coat. "Then we start tonight." Before O'Connor could answer, a sound split the air, the heavy creak of the chapel doors opening. Both men froze. A rush of cold air snuffed out 2 candles. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, boots striking wood. O'Connor's head jerked toward the sound. He knows. Ethan reached for his revolver, but it was too late. Gunfire exploded, the crack of rifles echoing off stone. Splinters of wood and shards of colored glass rained down. The massive crucifix above the altar shook, then cracked with a thunderous snap, splitting along its length before crashing to the floor with a clang that made the whole chapel shudder. Ethan dove behind a pew, dragging O'Connor down with him. Bullets tore through the benches. Outside, a horse whinnied, then silence. No lawmen, no help, only the echo of the attack. "Stay down," Ethan hissed. But the priest moved first. He rose to his knees, spreading his arms like a man at the pulpit one last time. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him but not stopping him. He lunged toward Ethan, shoving him hard to the side as another shot rang out. The second bullet struck O'Connor full in the chest. He fell against Ethan, blood soaking through his collar. His eyes searched Ethan's face, lips moving without sound. Then his hand dropped, the scorched Bible sliding from his fingers to the stone floor. Ethan held him, heart hammering. The papers were still in his coat, intact. The candles flickered wildly, as if the chapel itself were gasping. Outside, the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the night. And inside, Ethan felt the weight of both the priest and the truth pressing down on him. The crucifix lay broken on the ground, and so did Father O'Connor. The Dry Creek Rodeo began, as always, with the national anthem, and a prayer for safety. The old loudspeakers crackled. The crowd stood with hats to chests, and somewhere in the stands a child fidgeted with a small American flag. But beneath the red, white, and blue bunting, beneath the scent of sizzling brisket and the glitter of sequined cowboy shirts, tension coiled like a lasso ready to snap. Jonas McClane stood stiff near the north fence, eyes scanning the crowd. Silas Carter was on the other side of the arena, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Between them, a ring of townsfolk, rodeo clowns, livestock handlers, and a brass band struggling through God Bless America. And above it all, sitting in the VIP box like a ranch king, was Briggs. Ethan moved through the crowd, the bundle of proof heavy in his coat. Abigail followed close, trying to remain unnoticed. Every face they passed seemed either distracted or afraid, like folks knew something was coming, but were too proud to leave early. "Jonas won't hold back," Abigail whispered. "Neither will Silas." "They're not the problem," Ethan muttered. "Briggs is, and I'm going to prove it." In the center ring, a rider burst out of the chute atop a bucking bronco, drawing cheers. But it was hollow. People clapped with their hands, not their hearts. Then came the moment, the one Briggs had planned all along. A loud voice rang over the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mayor Briggs." Boos mixed with applause. Briggs stood, arms wide, smiling like a preacher about to deliver fire and brimstone. He began with words of unity, calling for calm. But Ethan heard the edge in his tone, the false piety. And then Briggs said something Ethan couldn't let slide. "Let's remember who brings violence into our homes," Briggs announced. "Let's not forget the Carter boys burned barns, or that McClane cattle trampled our fields. We must root out the rot." "That's enough!" Ethan stepped into the ring, voice sharp as a whip crack. Heads turned, gasps rippled. "Briggs is lying," Ethan continued. "I've got proof. Documents, maps, permits. He's been playing both sides, fueling the feud so he could take the water rights and sell this land out from under us." The crowd murmured in confusion. Jonas and Silas both began to push through from opposite ends, hands on their weapons. "You shut your damn mouth," Briggs shouted, face crimson. "He's delirious. Shot in the head last week. Check the papers." Ethan threw the bundle to the ground near the announcer's table. "He bought you all with fear." Suddenly, the sharp retort of a rifle cracked the air. A woman screamed. Then more shots. Chaos erupted. From behind the bleachers, Briggs's men opened fire, not at Ethan, but into the crowd. The rodeo exploded in panic. People screamed and dove for cover. Vendors overturned tables. A clown got trampled. Jonas fired into the air, trying to stop it. Silas ducked behind a gate, barking orders to his men. Then the pen gate burst open. A massive bull, confused and enraged by the gunfire, charged into the ring. Its horns slashed the air as it barreled through the wooden fencing, splintering it like twigs. Screams turned primal. The animal was out of control, just like the town. In the ring, Jonas and Silas came face to face, both covered in dust, both armed. They aimed at each other. Sweat trickled down their temples. Neither pulled the trigger. Not yet. Gunpowder still hung heavy in the air, the acrid stench of burnt wood and blood mixed with sweat and panic. The once proud rodeo grounds were now a wasteland. Fences shattered, banners torn, dust thick and choking. Cries echoed from every corner as townsfolk staggered to their feet, dazed. In the middle of it all, Ethan dragged Briggs by the collar, his shirt soaked with sweat, dirt, and shame. The mayor kicked and thrashed, but Ethan's grip was iron. "Get your hands off me!" Briggs spat, his voice wild. You've ruined everything. You did that yourself, Ethan growled, hauling him forward toward the broken announcer's booth where Jonas, Silas, and a ring of stunned townsfolk now stood. Time to tell them the truth. Briggs struggled, eyes darting toward his men, most of them now disarmed or scattered. A few lay groaning on the ground. The town wasn't with him anymore. Abigail stood near the edge, hands over her mouth, her eyes fixed on Ethan like he was walking a tightrope above hell. Ethan threw Briggs down hard onto the dirt. "This man lied to you all," Ethan shouted, pulling a folder from inside his coat. He held it up, waving the crumpled documents for all to see. Land deeds, forged signatures, drilling permits tied to out-of-state shell companies. He played both sides, lit the fuse on a feud, and planned to turn Dry Creek into a damn tourist resort while we bled each other dry. A hush fell over the crowd. Silas narrowed his eyes. Jonas stepped forward, took the papers from Ethan with hesitant fingers. His eyes moved slowly across the ink. Silas stepped beside him. "That your name on this permit, Jonas?" Jonas frowned. "No, it ain't. And mine neither," Silas added. The two old rivals looked at each other, not as enemies, but as men waking up from a long, ugly dream. Briggs staggered to his feet, sneering. "You think they'll believe you? I built this town. I kept it alive. Without me, you'd all still be herding tumbleweeds and praying for rain." "You built it on lies," Ethan snapped. Then Briggs's hand moved, too fast. From beneath his coat he yanked a knife, blade gleaming even through the smoke. He lunged at Ethan, mouth twisted into a snarl, eyes wild with desperation. Abigail screamed. Ethan barely had time to react. The blade caught his arm, slicing shallow. He stumbled back. Then a single shot cracked the air. Briggs froze mid-stride. His eyes widened, and for a second he looked more confused than afraid. Blood bloomed across his chest. He crumpled to the dirt like a marionette with its strings cut. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Everyone turned. Jonas stood with a rifle half raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He didn't say a word. Silas stepped forward and slowly knelt beside Briggs, checking for a pulse. Then he shook his head and stood up straight. Abigail rushed to Ethan's side, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. She wrapped her arms around him, not caring about the blood on his sleeve or the dust in her hair. She cried, not just from fear or grief, but from the unbearable weight of it all finally lifting. Around them, the people of Dry Creek stood still, watching, and for the first time in what felt like forever, no one reached for a gun. Morning sunlight spilled slowly over the ridge, casting long gold streaks across the battered remains of Dry Creek. The dust hadn't yet settled, and the town still smelled of ash and gunpowder, but there was something else in the air now, something quieter, something that might have been peace. The main street was almost silent. Where once shouts and gunfire had echoed, now only the shuffle of boots and the low murmur of voices remained. Storefronts were scorched. A few windows had been hastily boarded with scrap wood. The rodeo arena was cordoned off with rope, blood still staining the dirt. But people were out. They moved slowly, dazed perhaps, but purposeful, hauling debris into wagons, sweeping broken glass, straightening signs that hung crooked on bent nails. Ethan stood outside the old blacksmith's shop, arm still bandaged, the sting of the wound a dull throb he'd grown used to. Abigail stood beside him, her hand in his, their fingers intertwined like they'd always belonged that way. They looked out over the square where a small group of townsfolk were digging shallow graves for the ones who hadn't made it, men from both the McClane and Carter sides. No one asked questions about who wore which hat that day. They just dug. Jonas McClane stood near the fence post at the edge of the lot, staring down at the graves. His jaw was set tight, hands behind his back, rifle slung but untouched. Silas Carter was there too, across the yard, coat flapping slightly in the breeze. Their eyes met once. No words, no nods. But neither raised a hand, and that, for now, was enough. The church bell rang out, a single clean tone that soared into the morning sky, clear and undisturbed. It was the first time in weeks the sound had carried without being swallowed by chaos. People paused. Even the shovels fell still. Heads turned. Father O'Connor was gone, but the townsfolk had gathered in his honor. The small chapel's door stood open, smoke still curling faintly from the damaged roof. Inside, a new candle flickered beside the broken crucifix, its light small but stubborn. By mid-morning, makeshift tables were laid along the churchyard. A potluck, someone called it. Maybe no one had the appetite, but they brought what they could: pumpkin pie, smoked brisket, mashed potatoes, and coffee so strong it made your teeth itch. The food didn't taste the same, not quite, but the warmth, the act of gathering, was its own kind of healing. Children ran barefoot past broken hitching posts. An old woman handed out slices of sweet bread with hands that trembled. Men who had pointed rifles at each other just days ago now shared silence over tin cups of coffee. Ethan and Abigail sat together on the chapel steps. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. He glanced at the field beyond, where blackened earth stretched far as the eye could see. It would take seasons to grow back, but the soil hadn't given up. Not yet. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he exhaled, slow and steady. No promises were made, no guarantees whispered. Just the sound of wind and distant laughter. Just the quiet thud of earth over a coffin. Just the low hum of a town trying to remember how to be a town. Dry Creek was bruised, scarred, tired, but it was still here. And sometimes, survival was enough. When hatred becomes a habit, it can consume not just two families, but an entire town. Yet even in Dry Creek's ashes, we saw a fragile hope. People putting down their guns long enough to bury the dead together. The lesson is simple, but hard. Peace is not a gift, it's a choice. And if we don't choose it, someone else's greed will choose for us. What do you think? Is forgiveness ever truly possible after so much bloodshed? Share your thoughts below. If this story made you reflect, drop a 1 in the comments and tell us which state you're watching from. And if you love real stories from the true Wild West, don't forget to subscribe to True Wild West Stories so you won't miss the next tale.